welcome to today's video, and this is brought to you by Economics Made Easy. Today we're going to have a quick introduction to market structures. So I just want to clarify, I'm just going to be explaining the characteristics of these different market structures, the 4 different market structures which we're going to discuss today. So I'm not going to be going into diagrams like those diagrams which achieve economies of scale in the long run, the short run, drawing the diagrams of whether these firms can actually achieve allocative efficiency, showing those differences, evaluating the firms, and then comparing the firms, collusive, non-collusive, oligopoly, game theory. So those all come later, and I'm going to do in-depth long videos on each and every one of these market structures. So those videos are going to have a lot more detail. But for now, this is just a quick explanation of these different characteristics. So with that, let's get into it. So these are the 4 different market structures we're going to be dealing with. We have perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. Let's get right into it. Perfect competition and its characteristics. What you have to know for perfect competition is that there's a large number of firms, and all of these firms in the industry sell homogeneous goods. So that means identical goods. So there's no brand names and the goods aren't differentiated. Next, there's no barriers to entry. So essentially there's just free entry. So any firm that wants to actually enter the industry and begin producing this good or service can do so freely. Next, this model is actually this market structure is highly unrealistic, and there's very few examples in the real world that come close to this. In fact, there's actually very difficult to find any markets in the real world that meet these characteristics I represented. An example of one that does come close is agricultural commodities like wheat, rice, corn, and other commodities like gold or silver. Next, there's no market power. So market power actually refers to the extent to which each individual firm in the industry is actually able to control the price at which it sells its product. So in perfect competition, you're going to find that there's no market power. Next, in perfect competition, it's actually the only market structure where allocative efficiency is achieved. And we're going to see how this affects each of these market structures later when actually analyzing them. And since we know that that a monopoly has the greatest degree of market power, which we're going to get to later, we can also say that it has the greatest degree of allocative efficiency. So because we know what the connection I'm trying to make is that we know that these firms have varying degrees of market power, which actually result in market failure. So the degree of market power they have essentially directly refers to the amount of allocative inefficiency that actually occurs there. So we're gonna see that further later. Next, we have monopolistic competition. Now, monopolistic competition is very similar to perfect competition. There's a fairly large number of firms, there's no barriers to entry, and however, in monopolistic competition, there's what you call product differentiation. Now, what this means is that each firm actually tries to make its product different from those of the other firms in that industry. And they do this by changing quality, service, or packaging. So it actually tries to work with these different characteristics. And it's a good example because this is kind of monopolistic competition's way of achieving a certain degree of market power by controlling how it actually sells its product. So they're essentially the only producer of that particular version of the product. For example, if you look at shoes, Nike is a monopolistic of Nike, and then Adidas is a monopolist of Adidas. So these firms are using product differentiation in that way. But because there's so many brands as well, and because it's still in the same category which now we're discussing, like shoes, it's going to be difficult. It actually limits the degree of market power that can be controlled. And then it doesn't achieve allocative efficiency, which we're going to discuss later. And here we have the characteristics of an oligopoly. So an oligopoly is quite different. So we're going to discuss later that there's a collusive and non-collusive oligopoly, and they can also lead to cartels. And then it later comes to how the government deals with the abuse of market power. There's a lot of real-world examples that have occurred. I mean, you can look at Activision Blizzard and Microsoft. You can look at those yogurt cartels that have occurred in the past as well. Well, sorry. So that all will come later. But for now, this is what you need to know when it comes to the characteristics of these firms. So there's a small number of firms, and then products are differentiated or undifferentiated. So that means, so there's some differentiated products can be cars, furniture, etc. But then undifferentiated products would be like oil, for example. Now there's high barriers to entry, so it's difficult for a new firm to enter the industry. And as you know, an oligopoly has a high degree of market power, and that also means that it has a higher degree of allocative inefficiency than what you would say for monopolistic competition. Monopoly and its characteristics. So in a monopoly, there's a single seller or dominant firm in the industry. So what you can say is that essentially the single firm is the entire industry. So an example of a monopoly in the real world would, for example, be Microsoft, who controls 80% of the market, for example. And then you can actually make these connections for real world examples in economics. So you can actually search up Microsoft and its agreement it tried to form with Activision Blizzard, which was turned down. So that's also an example. You can use a real world example for government abuse of market power as well. And some others can also be this collusive and non-collusive, the collusive oligopoly, those yogurt cartels, for example. But that all comes later. So next, it sells a unique good or service with no close substitutes. And if there were substitute goods, then consumers could actually consider switching to buying those other substitutes, right? So there would no longer actually be a monopoly for the good. And as you know, there are high barriers to entry in the industry because the monopolist actually owes its dominance in the market. And this is also partly due to the inability of other firms to enter this market as well. And now, because it also has high barriers to entry, it also allows it to have the greatest degree of market power as well. So it's actually able to control the price at which it sells its product to a very large extent, and the largest extent out of all of these four market structures. Now, monopolies aren't met quite frequently in the real world as well, and there's only a very handful of monopolies that you can actually really think of as well. And again, being the sole producer, the monopolist has significant control over the price. So you just have to remember that's one of the main characteristics of monopoly. It has the greatest degree of market power. And we're actually going to be able to emphasize that as well by showing that both monopoly and oligopoly can achieve economies of scale in the long run. But that comes later again. And then monopoly, while it's also able to do that, has high allocative inefficiency, unfortunately. So we're going to see later as well, you actually buy those goods and services at a higher price, but there's a lower output, which is where you're going to see that allocative inefficiency in the producer-consumer surplus diagram. But again, it comes later. For now, these are the characteristics you have to know for each of these firms. Each of these market structures. But otherwise, that's it. It's a short introduction. Later is when we're going to get into a lot more detail. And like I mentioned before, they're going to be maybe even 15-20 minute videos just for each of these structures. And then I'm probably going to do a separate video which discusses how the government may respond to the abuse of market power. And not only that, but comparing each of these different market structures, such as monopolistic competition versus monopoly, for example. So it will take a lot of time and effort, but as long as it produces good content for you guys to learn and follow it, because this is an HL concept, so there's a lot of content behind it, but I'll do my best, and I'm sure that if you guys follow those videos well, you'll be completely fine for your exams. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.